Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Thank you so much, Debbie. I'll try to answer the question, how did I come to Russell Page? And I might not persuade you that I do know anything about landscape.
There's also a stand. You can look like a rock star.
Oh, I don't mind holding the microphone. I'm really excited to be here at LongHouse and to think with you a bit about modernism and Russell Page's version of modernism, which is not always visible at first glance at his work, and what people see and don't see about Russell Page's own approach to what he thought he was doing is something that I want to get into a little bit today. So this is the last of the kind of legendary figures that we're going to talk about today, Russell Page. Here he is, looking dashing and elegant with his signature cigarette, which he was constantly smoking in every occasion that he appeared in. 1906 to 1984 are the dates of his life. Although he was born in England and based in France for much of his career, he made gardens all over the world. And in his final decades, he made some spectacular gardens here in the United States. This is Kiluna Farm in Manhasset, and Page was one of a few architects and garden designers who worked on this project for Barbara and William Paley. Those are the kinds of clients that he worked for. A few things about this image, maybe I started with it because it's relatively nearby, but it maybe gives us a couple of things to think about in beginning to look at Page's work and think about what he was about. One would be the presence of water, absolutely essential piece of any Russell Page design, and something that for him connected all the gardens that he was making in the 60s and 70s and 80s all the way back to a deep tradition of garden design, which for him most significantly maybe had emerged from the Islamic garden designs that he got to know in the south of Spain. The other would be just something you can really see here, I think, would be a relation between geometry, the circular pond here, and the kind of wilder forms of the trees and shrubs around. So that relation between a geometry that we might most readily associate with modernism and the flow and kind of ramble and thorny funk of the natural world would be something to think about with Russell Page, I think. Here's another image of that landscape. So from the 1950s through the early 1980s, Page was, I think by almost any account, one of the most important and most glamorous figures in the world of landscape. He referred to himself as a garden architect rather than landscape architect sometimes, or simply as a gardener, as in the title of his book, The Education of a Gardener. He made gardens for aristocrats and industrialists and fashion icons like Oscar de la Renta. And here is how New York Times profile described him in 1980. It is beyond dispute that Russell Page, an Englishman now in his 77th year, has designed more gardens for more people in more parts of the world than anyone else in history. It's quite an opening and quite an account of this person's achievement and reputation. So certainly one of the most famous and most respected figures in his profession over the course of many decades. For all that, though, he seems to have remained something of an elusive figure, or had a kind of uncertain legacy. Recently, he was referred to as the most famous garden designer no one's ever heard of. This is a piece by Christopher Woodward, who runs the Garden Museum. Let me see if I can get rid of this. Oops. Oh, sorry about the annoying. Well, I don't have any clicker to click on it. Anyway, And the Garden Museum has an amazing online collection of images and drawings and plans and notebooks from Russell Page if you wanted to look through and find more. Soon after Page's death, this magnificent book by Shinzen Venezuelan was published. The garden on the cover there, which is the garden at the Villa Silvio Pellico in Turin, is one I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But already, as they prepared this book, and I really recommend it to you, not just because I think Russell Page is so interesting, but because it's really a great piece of garden writing and beautifully illustrated. And yet at the beginning, in introducing this book, the authors talk about how Page himself didn't really want to participate in this book, partly because he didn't think that a garden was something to be documented and preserved and photographed, but rather mattered in its living presence. And so if you couldn't go see the garden, you really weren't going to be able to encounter it in this way. But also because of a certain self-consciousness that a lot of these gardens had already fallen into disrepair or been remodeled or were in ruins. Oh yeah, please. And this is Fred Whitsey, the longtime garden correspondent for the Daily Telegraph, in an essay that he wrote also shortly after Page's death. Where does this man stand in the history of garden making? He remains elusive. So why he remains elusive, or why his legacy seems so uncertain, is something that I want to try to think a little bit about. He brings us to this really interesting mystery or paradox that we come up against when we start looking into Russell Page. Here's this highly accomplished and famous figure, but also somehow an obscure one. His gardens are crumbling at the end of his life, very little documentation or preservation. As I was talking with Debbie as we were getting ready to do this presentation, and we're both like, we can't find any good images of Page's gardens. I mean, not that we couldn't find any. We found some, but not in the way that you would for other comparable figures, I think. So I'm going to sketch out some ways of understanding and thinking about Page's work based on his own writings and some of the context from his life. And I want to try to describe his particular version of modernism, how he thought about the history of gardens leading up to the 20th century, how he responded to new technologies and some of the social situations from the 1930s through the 1980s. Oh, it came back. Great. I'll try to give you a sense of kind of Page's ethos or the principles and values that guided his art, which he described often in terms of spiritual harmony and balance and order. One of the things that has been just sort of touched on in other presentations today, I think, has to do with a relation between modernism and some kind of spirituality, or what kind of sermons are being given from the pulpit rock, or what kind of refocusing of our attention does the organization of a space kind of bring us into. Want to try again?
Yeah.
All right. This is going to be great content for what I'm about to talk about, which is distraction. Because before I tell you about Russell Page, I'm going to try to address a little bit of Debbie's question of like how I came from my work in the humanities to be thinking about Page and his career and his work. This is a little bit of background and by way of introduction, but also maybe by way of apology, because I'm not an expert in landscape architecture. And so part of what I said to Debbie is this: I would love to come talk about Russell Page if you will do the talk with me. So I'm going to turn, she's going to take over a little bit and say some more about some of the landscape architecture projects in detail and maybe some of the horticulture as well. But I'm coming to this from the humanities, from the study of literature and cultural history. And it's not only because our institutions in the humanities are collapsing and we have to seek homes in other places like architecture that I'm talking about Russell Page, but because of a sort of unfolding of my own interest. First of all, I was working on this book. This is my most recent book, Thoreau's Acts, Distraction and Discipline in American Culture, which was published 2 years ago by Princeton in 2023. It's not a book about design or horticulture. Instead, it's a book about the problem of distraction in American culture. a very live problem to us now for all the technological reasons that we've already had occasion to encounter right now. Maybe this is when I ask you to please silence your phones. But a problem that also goes back and really, in ways that were surprising even to me, had been a central problem in American literature and culture for a long, long time. And so Thoreau is kind of my figure for beginning to think about this problem. It's not all a book about Henry David Thoreau, but his way of explaining why he was going to Walden is a big part of what the book is about. And so he's talking about distraction. I believe, he said, that the mind can be permanently profaned by the habit of attending to trivial things. Or with reference to our phones, our inventions are wont to be pretty toys which distract our attention from serious things. And then he talks about, well, what are we going to do about it? What kind of remedy, what kind of therapy, what kind of self-transformation might be available to us if we have thus desecrated ourselves? And who has not? Generous, this has happened to all of us. The remedy will be by wariness and devotion to make once more a fane of the mind. A fane is a kind of temple. We know it usually by way of the word profane, which means outside the temple. But he's talking about a kind of becoming sacred again, or coming back into touch with the higher things. Now, for Thoreau, this had everything to do with leaving civilization, or leaving much of civilization, of course, and coming into contact with the natural world by way of landscape, by way of plants, by way of water. I love the wild, not less than the good, he said. This is kind of his ethics, you could say. I love the good. It's great to be good. Wild is just as good as good. Or I wish to speak a word for nature, for absolute freedom and wildness. So this is an unusual thing that's happening in the 18th, but especially in the 19th century around a figure like Thoreau, because there was a whole history of religious thinking about how our human nature is to be fallen and distracted and full of appetites and sinful, and we need to get control of ourselves and train ourselves and educate ourselves to focus on higher things. And Thoreau and the Romantics kind of go in the opposite direction. What they say is we naturally have a kind of attentiveness. We naturally are attuned to these things that matter, but our civilization has corrupted us. And so we need to unlearn all of those habits and set aside all of those distractions. And wildness is a way of getting in touch with that. Now, I don't know that Russell Page loved the wild not less than the good. And absolute freedom and wildness are almost never associated with Russell Page's garden designs. But I'm going to talk a little bit about about how one thing might be connected to the other. So while I was doing this work on Thoreau, I was also at the same time trying to learn how to make a garden of my own. I'm one of many people who took this up around the pandemic lockdowns, trying to get outside, trying to get my hands in the dirt, not knowing anything. I didn't know the difference between an annual and a perennial. I didn't know that a plant looked one way in March and another way in August. I was a genuine beginner at this. And it had never really occurred to me at that time that there were sort of different approaches to garden design, or different traditions, or that you might make a garden that meant one kind of thing as opposed to another kind of garden that was associated with other things. So these questions of formality and informality I began to try to learn about, or questions of using native plants versus exotics, or all of these kind of controversies that people who make gardens are often kind of thinking about and taking positions on. So this is the landscape that I made my garden in. This is the salt marsh in the estuary of the Quinnipiac River in Connecticut. So just on the other side of the Long Island Sound, and in an ecology pretty similar to the one that some of your gardens are made in around here. This is a picture that I took from my kayak rowing around the salt marsh. This is my staff, my head gardener. This is the entire labor force that I had to work with. And these are 3 pictures of the same person. I don't have 3 workers. I only have one. This is Van Smith working in the garden. You can see the river behind him there. So this is to give you a sense of the kind of resources that I had to work with. I'm working on a very small scale, and I don't have anyone to do, he makes things take 3 times as long as they would take if he was not doing anything at all. But there's this sort of before picture of just this yard, going up to the river, and then some pictures of the plants that I grew there. I'm really embarrassed to be showing you my garden to this crowd, but here it is, and it's by way of telling you about coming to Russell Page. So I'm learning, I'm thinking, going through trial and error, and more sort of beginning to have a sense of the kind of garden that I thought I would want to make. And like a lot of people these days, I was drawn to the idea of a wild-looking garden, partly because I didn't have the resources to really maintain a formal garden, but also partly because I love the wild not less than the good. And I've been reading all this Thoreau, and I was into nature, and I was feeling romantic about things, and I wanted a wildlife-friendly garden and so on. And so I was planting in this kind of chaotic way. And it worked a little bit. I have all these now garden visitors like diamondback terrapins and monarch caterpillars and so on. So if you're just finding your way into the world of garden making, as I was then you can get the impression, and I got the impression, that really there are these sort of 2 schools or 2 approaches to design. I don't think this is true at the level of landscape architecture, but I think it is true at the level of people who are making their own small-scale gardens. On one hand, formality, or a kind of rigid lines, geometries, imposing order on nature, with an emphasis on the artistry of the designer. On the other hand, informality, or naturalism, a sense of wildness, a sense of freedom. And you could track that, in the way that I kind of learned about it started with Pete Odolph's naturalism and then moved into more contemporary kinds of rewilding or habitat reestablishment and so on. And if you put it that way, would you like rigid formality and lifeless coldness? Or would you like the thrum of the natural world right outside your door? Then who wants to be on the side of rigidness and coldness? Certainly not somebody who loves Henry David Thoreau, who wouldn't want to be wild and free in all these ways. And so I did kind of pursue that version of the wild in my garden. I still do. And within a couple of years of getting started, I was picking up a little bit of practical knowledge and also doing a lot of reading, trying to learn how people who make gardens think about their craft, and sort of taking my side in what I saw then, at least, as the 2 schools of approaches to making gardens. And then at a certain point, I picked up this devilish book, Russell Page's memoir, The Education of a Gardener, from 1962. And I started to come across these strange, intriguing passages in which Page writes about his own thinking about making gardens. For instance, let's see if I have, this is just a passage about pruning a tree. If you've ever pruned a tree, maybe you've had this kind of transcendent experience in clipping off the branches. Page seems to have had it. I realized, he says, that I was working with space, carving the empty air into volumes caught in the angles of branch crossing branch and held by leafy sprays. So you see how this organic, this very material, the wood of the plant and its leaves and the shapes that it's making against the sky become this kind of abstraction for him. And he's seeing it in the way that an artist would see the arrangement of forms in space. Here in the circumference of a small tree lay the meaning of a whole relationship between art and nature. Not the opposition or the antagonism between art and nature, but this relationship between art and nature, right? So moving from the sense that one is against the other to some more complicated, more dynamic interaction between those two. As someone who reads literature, I am also just as moved by the elegance of Page's expression, by what a good writer he is. than by some of the ideas in him. You can see here, I think, something like a modernist sensibility that in which the form of the trees, the gnarled shape of the branches gives way to this abstract image or a sculptor's view of volume and shape. And maybe most intriguingly of all, the complexity of this relationship that he's suggesting between art and nature. So The Education of a Gardener is partly a memoir, and it tells the story of Page's initiation into the world of design and horticulture, tells the stories of the many gardens that he made over his career. And it begins with something almost like a reversal of the Genesis myth. Right? If way back then people were cast out of the garden, right, and they went out into the world, Page talks about the moment of kind of being drawn into the garden. And he's talking about being a very young boy and how he, an adolescent, I guess, one summer holiday when I was perhaps 14, that bored with the riding and jumping competitions at a local agricultural show, I wandered off to the flower tent. There, in an atmosphere hot and heavy with the smell of trampled grass, people, animals, and flowers, my attention was caught by a tiny plant of Campanula pula with 3 deep purple bells, huge in comparison with its frail leaves and the minute pot in which it grew. It was mine for a shilling, and it opened a new world for me. So this is the beginning of his kind of his fascination with nature and with plants and with garden making. Instead of being cast out of the garden, he seems to wander into it. He didn't go directly toward a career in landscape. He went to art school at the Slade School and studied painting and drawing. Began to think about color and form and pattern.
This is the ultimate in non-distraction.
This is great. You can check your email real quick.
We apologize.
No.
Just didn't like that error message up there.
Yeah. All right, great. That better? Okay. Thank you. But all that art school training ended up being very much a part of his work in making gardens. After art school, he found work in the offices of the landscape architect Richard Sudell. At first, he was working on kind of small suburban plots. But then he got this amazing kind of dream commission to go and work on his first big project here at LongHouse in Bath. Pretty good for someone just starting out. This is an Elizabethan era house, big house. And Page, in his memoir, uses it in a very clever way to give us what he thinks we need to know. He doesn't say it this way, but this is what I think he's doing as a writer, a little miniature history of all of garden making. Because this place has been around so long, it's built on the foundations of an old medieval priory, so it began as a religious institution. Then someone came in and made a formal Renaissance garden around the time that the house was made. Then, no less than Capability Brown was brought in to redo the landscape and design, the great park maker of the 18th century, to make the parkland around the house. Then, in the Victorian era, they brought in all these exotic plants from all around the empire and hothouses and orangeries and all of that kind of stuff that the Victorians were so interested in. And then they brought in Russell Page. Right? So here he comes, taking his place in the history of the eras of garden design. And Page describes sort of learning from this place. He was actually, part of his job was to kind of freshen up or rework the parkland that Capability Brown had done. And he talks about learning the site. We walked the open parkland for days. And their task there, as he says, about walking it with the Marquess of Bath is to add new groups of trees where the composition of the landscape seemed to require them. I just light on this phrase because It's so far away from the idea of imposing an order on the natural world. Where does the composition of the landscape require us to do something? What is this site telling us needs to be done, rather than what is my grid that I'm going to impose on this? This big job at LongHouse opens up new opportunities for Page. He gets to know the architect Jeffrey Jellicoe and enters into a partnership. So Page and Jellicoe have a business together in the 1930s, and he begins to contribute to this new publication, edited by Sudell, Landscape and Garden magazine. This is the winter 1937 issue, and you can see something of the modernism of this magazine, I think, in an image like this, how stylized it is. You can also almost see something like the symmetry of that pond that we were looking at the beginning already in this design. I brought in, I'm going to show you the advertising pages of this magazine, because they do give you a sense of what was happening in the making of gardens in this moment. Look at this thing. It mows your lawn. Right? These are some of the new technologies, right? Planning a modern garden, an experience in collaboration. A good lawn deserves the best mower. I mean, you would see this stuff in House and Garden magazine, even now maybe. But the idea is that what matters that I'm trying to show you is how much new technologies, new industrial technologies, and the suburbanization of the world is changing the way people are making gardens in this moment that Page is developing. Page's writing for the magazine, or you could say his beat for the magazine, was garden history. So he wrote about classical gardens, he wrote about Islamic gardens, he wrote a whole article, 2-page spread with one-word title, Urns. Whole article about urns in gardens. I think this is maybe one of the most characteristic writings, the green garden. Right? What is that invisible color that we don't see in the garden, or that we associate with the garden, but beneath the flowers, what is this green pattern that we might see? And he sees it, he kind of traces it from the early gardens all the way through. What is the very idea of a garden? And you can see him sort of thinking about what were all these cultures doing with gardens before, and now, in the 1930s and the era of the lawnmower and so on, do we even have such a traditional culture anymore? And what kind of garden might express the world that we're in? That's the kind of modernist question. He's on the rise in this period. He's making a name for himself. He's finding his calling. And then the world around him just goes up in flames. Within a week of the beginning of the war, our practice ceased to exist. And all my modest accumulation of plans, photographs, and 18th century garden books went up in flames in the first London Blitz a year later. So this is the end of, people are now going to allotments, they're trying to grow food. No one's hiring a landscape architect to come redo their Longleat house in the context of the war. Page has a job with the British military. It's a bit obscure what he was doing. I think probably doing some propaganda, like making posters for them and so on. But he's sent around the world. He goes to Cairo in Egypt, eventually to what he calls Ceylon, what we would call Sri Lanka. And he's being sent around as part of something about the empire's war effort. But in all of his free time, he's visiting mosques and gardens and temples in all of these spaces that he's going to. And he talks about seeing the world for the first time from a non-European point of view, so seeing this kind of global perspective and becoming really interested specifically in the kind of spiritual traditions of the places that he was going to. So if he had, kind of entered into the paradise of the garden before, and now he was cast out, he was drifting around the world. But as he's drifting around the world, he's going into these sacred sites, things that he's read about, and so on. I had one special pilgrimage to make, he says. He's going to see these great Buddhas that he's read about back in England before he traveled. And he comes to feel that these travels are transformative for him as a human being and as an artist. As he says here, my wartime travels were in their own way an important part of my education. Although I learned little of plants or gardening, probably whatever he's seeing in Sri Lanka is not going to grow so well in Cornwall anyway. I had learned that life can be otherwise experienced than from the European point of view. So this cosmopolitan initiation into another world point of view, again, something we would never associate, I think, with classical French Le Notre garden design. That is the European point of view, right? And Page is getting initiated into something else. So he talks about then this experience of coming back and a feeling of real, I think what we would now call trauma, pretty casually, about what the experience of the war had been for him. 4 wartime years of intense activity, new scenes, new people, new impressions were over, and I found myself in London without money or occupation. The rhythms and the urgency of the previous years had become a habit, and for a while, I was totally at a loss in a world to which I had become unused. So he finds himself disturbed and estranged, wandering around London, no money and nothing to do. Really a kind of modernist protagonist of his own story, but this is his experience. And he goes back and starts learning how to draw again. So he studies very simple kind of still life drawing to try to just come back into a sense of being able to see and think again. And this is what he writes about that experience. To study the nature and form of the object in front of me gave me back the possibility of another kind of vision and another kind of discipline. And little by little, a vast weight of accumulated superficialities fell away from me, so that after some time I felt refreshed and quiet, because I knew again that there is a continuing reality behind the appearances and problems of every day. This is about an experience of art that has this profoundly therapeutic effect on him. And it's about a kind of discipline of retraining himself how to see. In my book, Thoreau's Acts, I talk about disciplines of attention as the practices that we put ourselves through to try to undistract ourselves. If you think about mindfulness and the kinds of meditation and so on that we do to try to unplug, Page himself uses this phrase, discipline. So here's my connection to Henry David Thoreau, after all. In some ways, this is what I was already thinking about, or at least this is why Page is resonating with me. He moved to France and began to work again, making gardens. And over the next several decades, he made several masterpieces, always working alone, never with a large firm or really training anyone else up under him, which is maybe one reason for the kind of obscurity of his legacy, that no one has carried it on and continued to describe it in the same way. There are other reasons too, I think, why he came to be seen as something of an outsider, and I'll touch on those. One in particular just has to do with his embrace of French and Southern European gardening traditions and his abandonment, or his sometimes, I think, fair to say, hostility to the English tradition. These gardens were informed, as I say, by continental traditions, by classical French and Italian design, and I think you can see the influence of those traditions. There's Page in his older age, looking a bit like a vampire. This is a Swiss garden. You can see the symmetry here going down to the lake. At a certain point, Page made a garden for the Chelsea Flower Show, 1958. Chelsea Flower Show, you probably know, is like the annual gathering of English gardening culture. And as much a space of national celebration and the celebration of the English gardening tradition as anything else, and Page says, "How do you like my French kitchen garden?" But he wins a gold medal at Chelsea for this garden, so it's respected despite this little bit of a perverse or punk gesture that he might have made there. Let me sort out my page. Okay. This is Villa Silvio Pellico that I mentioned before in Turin. That's 3 terraces, and then there are 2 smaller gardens with pools here on the sides that you can't quite see in this photo. You can see how, from a certain point of view, if you looked maybe only at and this is going back even to Barry's point about architectural design before, if you looked maybe only at the shape of the hedges and the pools, you would see a rigid abstract form. When you set it in the broader landscape, you see the interaction between those forms and all of this wildness. They're taking these great pictures in spring, of course, when all the trees are flowering. But by a strange twist of fate, these beautiful gardens may have contributed to the eventual fading of Page's reputation. They were, maybe you could say, too perfect, or too clean, too geometrical, seemingly austere for some contemporary tastes. And they looked to some observers, or were dismissed by some observers, as imitations or retreads of classical styles, Italian gardens or so on. This one at the bottom has what Page called an arabesque pattern, so he's tapping in again to the Islamic tradition. But for Page, these were not at all a return to the style of Versailles or Le Notre, and not a nostalgic attempt to go back to the days of monarchies and empires or rigid order. Definitely not soulless attempts to impose reason and art on the unruliness of the natural landscape. He did draw from many traditions, and as I say, the most important of all may have been that Islamic design, the kind of things that he could see in the south of Spain, at the Alhambra and places like that, if you maybe have visited those. But also the remnants of many other smaller gardens. There's a wonderful little anecdote in The Education of a Gardener where he talks about being in Malaga, Spain, and being invited to see an Italian, so-called Italian garden. And he's looking at the Italian shapes and he says, "This is too good. Its relation to the site is too perfect. I have a suspicion." He starts to wander around the garden and poke around in the corners. And he finds the remnants of the old Islamic water fountain. And he says, that's who really made this garden, right? They understood the site in a way that this Italian garden maker wouldn't have understood it. He did care very much, obviously, about form, symmetry, harmony, the geometry of a design. In his drawings, you can see some of these shapes almost as abstractions. But he wasn't imposing rigidness. He was trying to find a harmony within the site. This is how he talks about the site where he built the Villa Silvio Pellico garden I've just been showing you. When I first saw this garden, a steep bank beyond the lawn gave onto a very ugly sloping kitchen garden with badly sited cold frames. I never want him to write about my garden. And many diagonal paths. To replace all this, I devised a simple series of horizontal levels. One thing to note about this is that he's not sweeping away nature. He's sweeping away somebody else's work, right? There's this kind of badly arranged garden, and he's going to replace it with something else. So in this way, by way of the simplicity, by way of bringing the harmony into the site into harmony with the larger landscape around it, he meant to make his gardens a space of spiritual recovery and connection. He expressed his vision most eloquently, to my mind, in this unpublished manuscript fragment that I came across in a thesis by Kevin Barton, an English garden designer who wrote a thesis about Page. And Page is here describing all the different kinds of gardens that you might see. We have gardens with geometrical structures which embody philosophical, mathematical, and metaphysical ideas. Any of these will do. Though I would prefer to consider them, gardens that is, as ordered three-dimensional patterns fixed in time and space, through which flows nature, the vegetable world, proliferation, growing, dying, budding, flowering and seeding, impermanent, undisciplined, and usually the antithesis of order. This almost could have been written by Walt Whitman, that last list of kind of verdant, funky adjectives. But you see, this is what I think Page means by when he says a relation between art and nature. Right? These ordered three-dimensional patterns fixed in time and space. That's something like the design or the hardscaping, right? Through which flows the vegetable world, proliferation, growing, dying, budding, and so on. Right? And this interaction between those two, between the form or the art and the natural that's crawling over it and spilling out of it, is his vision of what a garden is here. So that's art in nature. The artist makes a pattern. Nature, with all of its wildness and unpredictability, grows within and around this form. He saw something like this once at a Le Corbusier property, where Le Corbusier seems to have simply spread some earth and allowed whatever seeds and weeds to come in to proliferate there on that property. And Page says in The Education of a Gardener, I really saw the beauty of this. There's a relation to the modern. I'll end with a few images of work from nearby. This is the courtyard garden at the Frick in Manhattan, which some of you may have had a chance to visit. It's recently been, because the Frick has been completely remodeled, the garden is being redone according to Page's own design, but with new plantings, which to me raises this really interesting kind of conceptual question about, is it still the same garden? You know? It is and it isn't. These are some of the Japanese elements in the PepsiCo gardens in Westchester County, where Page was brought in to make the garden to hold Donald Kendall's sculpture collection. Here he is at work, unglamorous, cigarette dangling, looking at plants. And there are stories about this giant, imposing, refined intellectual of a man getting himself up onto the tractor or digging himself in the land as he was working on it. He ended up saying, I have no garden of my own, and what I have learned has been from the years of working on other people's ground. But I allow myself daydreams. And the last chapter of The Education of a Gardener is simply a prose description, a piece of writing about what his garden might look like if he was ever to make one. It was an imagined garden, and he did it in writing, not in the landscape. So that's the spirit of my piece of this presentation. And now I'm going to ask the great Debbie Nevins to come up and talk a little bit more about his projects. Thank you.
I'm just going to make this very short because I know everyone's hungry. I want to go back. Thank you. This is Russell Page's grave, and he didn't want it be marked and found at all. It's at Badminton, which is a great estate, and he was a friend of the Duke. But it just speaks to me about the other side of him, which Caleb was trying to make you understand, and there is that contradiction in him. This is a work that was very important to me. It's St. Paul's Waldenbury outside London, where the Queen Mother lived, and it's by Geoffrey Jellicoe. And let's see, how do I get my notes here? Let's see if I can do this. For me, the key was, and I think you see this in Russell Page too, the articulation of space and what was mentioned before about Harriet Pattison, intensifying this connection between nature and man, and by, in my mind anyway, these clipped hornbeam hedges among these native natural trees really intensifies that experience of nature and making and placemaking. This is Geoffrey Jellicoe's Runnymede Memorial to John Kennedy. But again, just to give you a sense of who Jellicoe was. This is Ronchamp from the air drone, and I think Barry showed this before, but Le Corbusier at the end of his life really demonstrates how intensely he understood landscape and the way this was sited on this hill. Here's the section by Renzo Piano when he added to the site for a place for the nuns to live in a reception center. But for me, the image, the graphic image in the middle, speaks a lot to Renzo's own understanding of the softness and relationship of nature and architecture. This is a the Maison Jaoul, 2 villas in Neuilly, outside Paris, by Le Corbusier in the 50s. And I saw it 30 years ago, and it was the first green roof I ever saw. But I think that, it really speaks to Le Corbusier's own understanding of landscape towards the end, even more towards the end of his life, where he tried to integrate the building with landscape. So I'm just trying to pull together a few of the themes today. And this is the green roof. He just took the debris from the excavation and put it on the roof and let nature take its course, which is what Russell Page saw in his own apartment terrace that was mentioned by Caleb, where he writes in the book about how, seeing this, he said, now I know how to approach modern architectural high-rise buildings. This is the drawing of the Maison Jaoul, and you can see at the top, he immediately in the beginning envisioned a green roof. This is just quickly the interior, but here is a shot of one of the panels that opens out onto the green roof. So it was integrated totally with the 2 houses. This is White Birch Farm, which Russell Page did for Peter and Sandy Brandt, the art collectors. It's based on Mount Vernon, and it was my first job. This is my garden there. He didn't get on very well with them, and they let him go, or he let them go. I don't know the whole story, but then I came in to do all the planting. But what I learned from it, which unfortunately is not available in photographs, is that the front, you can imagine what a Mount Vernon house looks like. And it's on this beautiful piece of property in Greenwich, with hills on one side, and then below is a pond. But you would think that Russell Page would have brought the driveway dead on to the front door. But instead, he came around the side, and over 2 years, he root pruned a 19-inch tulip tree and put that right in the middle of the courtyard. So to him, it was more important for this experience of landscape and connecting, in a way, the building to the landscape than a head-on shot of this classical facade. For me, that was astounding. But it spoke to his kind of freedom, you might say, in his design work. This is an old roses, specie roses that I used. This is Longleat, which Caleb mentioned, the orangery. But again, a formal, classical building, but the rigidity of an abstraction of the design is what, to me, is so modern about Page. Here's another at Longleat, but using these clipped hornbeams as space making, and that's what you see throughout his more formal designs, is this constant abstraction of space and leading you onto a garden. Here's another example that's in the book, but I don't even have to say much about it, but how maybe Mies could have designed these hedges. Another example in Italy, the foreground pool is round and it's a swimming pool. Then the square one in the back. But he brought these 2 pools together, and then these cypress trees focus you on the distant view in, it seems to me, a very modern way. This is the Agnelli Villa, and there's a lot I could say about it, but so you have a 18th century house outside Turin, and he was asked to come in and planted these trees, but all that's in the front is this abstract, small, round pool with a fountain, and beyond this magnificent evergreen. This is PepsiCo, which you can visit. And again, you see in his later years being much more loose with the planting and naturalistic, in quotes. This is a sculpture garden, but a huge park, and here he uses clipped hornbeam in front of this Edward Durrell stone building to soften it, and people have lunch underneath. You see the sculpture. Another example. This is a penultimate design with Paul Rudolph for the Bass family in Fort Worth. It's actually for sale now, if you know anyone who wants to buy it. But he used these lawn steps to get you down to this very, very simple, long pool with Ismail. And here's the roof plan. But you can see the abstraction of the landscape design. This is the plan of the house. And here you see more how he integrated with grass steps. And this double alley of live oak that are clipped as the circulation pattern, and also making a quotes, a kind of living wall that defines that lawn beyond, and a blue atlas cedar. This is the orchid house. And that's it. Thank you for coming. Thank all my speakers, Phil and Barry and Caleb.